Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This is the Africa-China Initiative webinar on the BRICS Summit and potential implications for Africa and global governance. Just a couple words about the Africa-China Initiative. It is a joint project of the African Studies and Asian Studies at the School for Foreign Service at Georgetown. We have generous funding from the Henry Luce Foundation for another couple years to bring you exciting programs like this. My name is Yoon Jung Park. I am the program director of ACI, and I also teach a course on China's evolving role in Africa at Georgetown. The co-sponsors of this event and all of the events in our series are the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Events here at Georgetown and Howard University Center for African Studies. We're going to hold this event conversations or interview style rather than presentations, and I'm very, very pleased and honored to present two of the foremost experts on BRICS as our panelists. The first is Mehelia Papa. She is a senior fellow at the Fletcher School where she co-founded and led the Rising Power Alliances project and served as faculty in sustainable development and global governance. She's an expert in negotiation strategy and coalition building with a specific focus on BRICS and the transition to sustainability. Papa started her work on BRICS as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Law School and then as a visiting scholar at Fudan University's Center for BRICS Studies and has authored several BRICS-related publications. Our second expert is Ms. Sanusha Naidu, who is a foreign policy analyst and senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. Her research interests include democratization in Africa, Africa's political economy and development, and Africa's relations with emerging powers from the South, in particular BRICS and IBSA. She is an old friend, and we've done work together on China-Africa issues, so I'm very, very pleased that she could join us from South Africa. The event today is going to be moderated by our own Professor Ken Opalo, who is an associate professor in the School of Foreign Service, my colleague in African Studies, and this semester, my boss as the interim director of African Studies. His research interests include legislative development, the politics of service provision under decentralized government, education reforms, and electoral politics in emerging democracies. So I will hand it over to Ken to start our conversation. Thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Yoon, and thank you to our two panelists for making the time this morning. As Yoon mentioned, we're going to have a conversational discussion in which I'll pose questions, we'll go back and forth, and then we'll open it up to Q&A towards the end. So I'd like to start with you, Sanusha. So many of the audience may perhaps not have a clear understanding what BRICS is about. So could you just give us a brief overview of what BRICS is about, some background, what it doesn't or doesn't do, and key achievements, and perhaps, what it thinks it can do moving forward, so we have a good sense of BRICS as a thing.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. Good day, rather. It's very nice to be on the platform again. Thank you again to Yoon and to allowing me to be part of this very important discussion with colleagues and new colleagues to be acquainted with. I think, firstly, to contextualize the BRICS, I think the BRICS really comes out of the way in which the countries, the fomenting countries, the countries that initially thought of this conceptualization, and I'm not referring to the Jim O'Neill conceptualization. I think I'm going to take it to more the interstate grouping of how they wanted to actually navigate the international financial architecture. It's really around India Russia, China kind of architecture, looking at the way in which they conceptualize themselves in terms of dealing with the financial markets, the equity markets, looking at how they want to basically construct their identity, construct their footprint, and define their institutional engagements around the global architecture. And it came home very much at the 15th BRICS Summit this year in Johannesburg, hosted by South Africa last month, where there was a return to those questions about what is the formation of the BRICS. Not necessarily the BRICS as conceptualized by the Goldman Sachs understanding of profit making for customers or windfalls, etc., about where the next big take is, but rather I think comes out of the 2007-2008 architecture, where the financial system was going through a very serious level of instability and a very important, if not a vulnerability in terms of the fallout. And in that context, the way in which the G20 was formulated as well plays a critical role in the parallel and the way in which the parallel processes around the BRIC tends to formulate and articulate and incubate itself. So it comes out of in the first summit, or rather in 2009, when the formation of this interstate group came together. And let me say at the outset that it doesn't have an institutional architecture that binds it. There's no secretariat. There's nothing that actually keeps it as the kind of interstate or an intergovernmental positioning. It's almost like broadly aligned, in my view, along the lines of how the G20 countries come together on key critical issues that are of importance and geostrategic consideration in terms of the global architecture. And in that context, I think coming back to the global economic governance reform is quite critical to the way the BRICS sees its role. And the formation of it is really, I think, twofold. It's one on the financial instability and architecture of vulnerability, but it's also on the economic governance architecture. The institutions that currently are in a state of, I wouldn't say lack of reform, but I think they are in a state of inarticulation. And I'm talking about the World Trade Organization, where you're finding a lot of the institutional issues, particularly relating to the trade regime, the global architecture on intellectual property rights, etc., made more critical and exacerbated by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and around value chains and global value chains, and how these global value chains have actually been kind of brought to a standstill around investment, infrastructure, etc. It's around the trade regime. And I think that trade regime comes back to the currency question. So in a way, I think what the BRICS have done is kept themselves informal, but at the same time tried to shape key institutional issues when it comes to the global governance economic agenda. But at the 15th BRICS Summit, the question that was raised was, has the BRICS now moved from its economic articulation to a more geopolitical articulation of its identity? And I think the challenge there is really the challenge that you cannot separate the geoeconomics from the geopolitical and vice versa. Because right now, what we are seeing in the architecture of the global economic arena is the politicization of trade, the whole securitization of the digital and the technological issues that we are dealing with regard to the trade war or the trade conflict, or the issues around chips and semiconductors, the question of the digital transformation, but the digital technological divide, challenges around critical minerals. All of this is coming right down to the very core issues around the kind of geopoliticization and securitization of trade. So what the BRICS is really trying to find a way to navigate this, but not necessarily, in my opinion, to really create an alternative world order. I don't think they're doing that. They're not creating an alternative world order. The perception is that they want to create an alternative world order, but unfortunately they are very much integrated into the current world order. So whatever happens in this world order will affect the BRICS, and most importantly will affect the bigger actor in the BRICS, and that's China, and will have very dire consequences for China because of how China is interdependent in this economic order with the USA and vice versa, and all of the other countries are in that space. So I think what they've done is that they've created what they feel are institutions that they could actually not necessarily rewrite the rules of the game, but try and shape those rules and those normative standards. So one of it is the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank. The other is the contingency reserve arrangement. The other is the localization of the local payment system, which was very much a topic of discussion at the 15th summit. And then, of course, there are various other streams. There's the BRICS Civil Society stream. There's the BRICS Business Council. There's the labor trade movement stream. There's a political parties discussion, which they want to inaugurate and institutionalize as a stream. There's the BRICS Parliamentary Forum that's also there. And of course, the Women in Business Alliance that came up as well. But these are streams that kind of work as the run-up to the main event, and that's the summit. So all of these streams kind of have the academic forum, the university think tank partnership, all of these streams kind of work together, but they don't necessarily are basically saying that they're reshaping what the BRICS comes up with in the declaration. What they do is that they submit their own kind of declaration to the BRICS summit, and then it gets incorporated. I think the key issue for the BRICS, apart from the global economic agenda, is the global governance agenda of reform of the UN Security Council. And we saw this in the summit of the 15 BRICS, where you kind of got the sense that for the first time, Russia and China kind of came out and said, well, yeah, we want China, South Africa, Brazil, and India to kind of gave them a special mention. I wouldn't say endorsing them for a reformed UN Security Council, but gave them a special mention in terms of the developing world. The other issues is really around terrorism issues as well. So I think what the BRICS is not necessarily wanting to reshape an international architecture that says we are front and center, but just to have an adjacent playing field that they can feel comfortable with, but still tied into the mainstream in terms of where they are. And I think the big challenge for the BRICS now is the expansion question, and how that expansion question changes the identity of the BRICS going forward, and will they have to institutionalize more formally whether they want to create a secretariat and so forth.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think what you said there, one of the sort of more important points among the many important points you made, is the fact that the BRICS is not trying to supplant the existing international institutions. In fact, last week we had the foreign minister, what was it this week? The foreign minister of South Africa, who was very adamant that the BRICS members still see the UN as the premier institution of global governance, and they're not trying to get rid of the existing structures, whether their intention is to reform them. So thank you very much for those opening remarks. And I hope our audience now have a nicely textured understanding of what BRICS is about. Over to you, Mihaela. So one of the sort of threads building off of what we've been talking about with Thanusha, this idea that yes, BRICS started off as an economic outfit, and now it's, you know, because of current events and time, it's growing to also play a geopolitical role, whether actively or passively. Could you tell us a little bit more about how we should understand BRICS as a geopolitical actor in the current moment?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I am very honored to be with you, and I would like to thank the Africa-China Initiative for organizing the event. So to start off, in terms of geopolitical role, personally, I always saw BRICS as having a geopolitical role, because the question has always been how to pursue multipolarity in a system that was, at the time when BRICS were forming, still very unipolar. So the question, that question probably goes back like 2 decades with Russia-China 1997 declaration to pursue a multipolar order, with IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa trilateral dialogue to see how they as big countries can have, and powerful countries can have, greater voice. So I see BRICS as a continuation of these ideas, and actually the pursuit of multipolarity that's much more implemented through a body, and actually signals what can be possible and how to shape the narratives that are BRICS focused, BRICS agendas focused. So in that sense, that the geopolitical component has been there as for the group, because we can look at the group as having political relevance in terms of being a voice for multipolarity. We can look at it as having economic relevance in terms of adding new economic structures like the new development bank or a contingent reserve arrangement. We can look at it as shaping geopolitical discourse through academic exchanges that are intensified through think tank BRICS Center for BRICS cooperations. We can also see the symbolic relevance in thinking about how geopolitics plays out, because BRICS is an example, as Sanusha greatly introduced, of an informal institution. So you basically now see an informal institution playing almost like an outsized role in world politics, and that's much more of a trend now that you rely. I mean, who was talking about G20 like 5 years ago? Now we're talking more about G20 and BRICS than we are talking about the UN. So in a way, almost like the energy and the focus of action has moved from what used to be like UN, like technical cooperation, to these like big summit dramas, like like we have now climate conferences, the COPs. Now we have G20 BRICS summits. So I see that there has been this difference. Geopolitically, my most important takeaway from the BRICS summit is that BRICS finally aligns with China's priorities. That was not the case before. So when China started with BRICS, China was very interested in the trade agenda. And China even proposed a free trade zone for BRICS, and there were no takers, interest didn't pick up. And then in 2017, China proposed the expansion agenda. So we are talking about China's willingness to work with BRICS on an agenda it championed, which did not play out for it, and still being engaged. And then finally now it got the expansion agenda, and it got the trade agenda because the countries that BRICS expanded to are important trade partners. So, and also want to trade in local currencies. So basically, China made a major push in terms of meeting its priorities. So geopolitically, as BRICS is becoming more aligned with China, that means that there will be more attention to it, and potentially new opportunities for impact will open. Finally, from a geopolitical perspective, there is a larger institutional vacuum where you see that old multilateral institutions are not reformed. And I mean, just the idea that like you have the UN Security Council where people don't show up for meetings, like the top people, and where Africa, like a single African country, is not like a permanent member. I mean, that kind of tells you enough about like how old-fashioned the institutions are. And geopolitically, also, what we see is that global South, and people are like now debating whether that's a good term to use, but like global South is getting much more attention and importance. And I've never heard as many debates on like what should be the US policy toward global South. That wasn't something that was debated as frequently as all other types of policies. So another geopolitical maybe like challenge that I see moving forward, BRICS expanded to countries that are fossil fuel friendly, and we are going into COP, climate negotiations, transition to sustainability. And this BRICS Summit Declaration recognized the important value of fossil fuels in the transition to sustainability. So that's one area where the geopolitics of climate will change through BRICS. And the question whether BRICS, expanded BRICS, which will comprise a lot of like majority of emissions, will both be able to decarbonize in a way, keep that on the agenda, but at the same time, how this will play out in terms of the pressure on developed countries, like industrial countries, or developed the way like the climate frameworks use the term, and kind of more responsible, common but differentiated responsibility. So will this differentiation in responsibilities be given greater focus, and much more pressure on loss and damage, much more pressure on the countries, developed countries, to actually deliver on the climate aid front. So these are some of the preliminary trends that I see coming out from the summit.
Sorry, Ken, you're still muted.
Oops, sorry. Just a quick follow-up before I go back to Sanusha. You said that the expansion included these sort of fossil fuel dependent states, right? Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE being sort of the big ones to join, and that will complicate the sort of climate discussions, which is front of mind, right? And in addition, right, I think you rightly point out that over time it's become impossible to ignore BRICS as just a grievance club, as some previously put it. And so two questions. One, could you tell us a little bit about how the sort of global north has reacted to BRICS? So it was interesting, for example, to see the US make an effort to have the US, Brazil, and South Africa sign a joint declaration on the sidelines of the G20 meeting, sort of the overt acceptance of the African Union as a permanent member, right? Can we attribute some of these actions and maybe perhaps even call them reactions to geopolitical pressure coming from BRICS? And then I think it's interesting that you pointed out this call for a differentiated approach to climate. Again, the South African minister was adamant, right? She in fact used the exact same sort of phrasing that responsibility isn't equally shared, and so the response has to be differentiated with attention to each country's level of development. So again, in the broader sort of context, in what ways are global north countries or the Western Alliance as a unit responding to BRICS?
So it was very easy to ignore BRICS before because it was not very visible. So BRICS would have its summits, and then usually there was very little coverage of these summits I can talk about the US, but I know for the EU newspapers that similarly the case. This was the first year when there was actually a lot of coverage, where you don't need to go to a super specific, narrow, like foreign policy discussion to actually have somebody talk about BRICS. The way I see the Biden administration responding, of course, that I'm not part of the discussion where they define the response. So it's the observation of the response. When Biden administration started, there was this big like democracy summit. These are democracies, these are autocracies. That's who we cooperate with. And now you don't see that like divisive language to that extent. Now you see a lot of coalition building. So in a way, there is a lot of coalition building on the BRICS side and expansion, and there is parallel coalition building networking on the US side. So looking at different realignments of current groups, building new networks, reinforcing networks. So I think these are the some of the changes. I think you rightly pointed out the G20. The fact that now African Union is a member, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't think that would happen if BRICS was not there, and it's actually. I think that's where we see the main. The main debate in the US, at least. I think one big downside of the debates is that BRICS gets to be, in a way, sliced in the areas where it's affecting the US, which is normal. But I don't think that there is a full understanding of how big this cooperation is. It's almost like, I've been working on BRICS for 10 years. I read every summit, every before-after documents, look at count all the working groups and so on. But the whole infrastructure that was developed that's incredible. And I don't think there is the full weight of that infrastructure and understanding of it in the US or in the global north. So it's almost like there is this whole movement, and even when you listen to, let's say, Republican debates, like, dividing China and Russia, or dividing, just the fact how deep and big and strong these networks are. And even think about, like, in the Russia context, all of the BRICS decided to switch the order of hosting the summit just so that, like, the next time it can be in Russia. So when you look at the depth of these connections and how they have been built since 2009, 2010, that's like deeper and deeper policy coordination and stronger networks. So at this point, when you look at expansion, it won't be like a continuous move. So the question will be, can it proceed the same way, or will there be some change?
Thank you very much for that overview. And over to you, Sanusha. So one of the sort of questions, right, if we can dive in a little bit on the economic front. So the BRICS, part of the BRICS agenda is to sort of reform the global economic governance architecture by creating potential alternatives. So the idea of, trading in own currency, the BRICS Bank, thinking a lot more about, South-South economic cooperation. How should we think about that in a context of, say, potential World Bank reforms? I know the WTO is probably not fixable anytime soon, but there have been some interesting movements as far as the World Bank and other sort of multilateral financial institutions go. How will BRICS in its different ways impact the global trade regime and the global sort of financial architecture?
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to Michaela, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I want to circle back to the issue of, this coalition building within the BRICS, and of course the way this is now changing the language even in the US. I think the one issue is quite important is the question of how is BRICS really about only China and the BRICS, or is it now becoming China and India in the BRICS? Because I think very often the idea that India is the kind of interlocker in the BRICS, is it the coalition partner for the developed North, for the global North in a way? Because two things happened. One was the MOU that the US had signed with the IPSA countries, and I can see that becoming almost the way in which India is navigating its own positioning in the BRICS as well as that kind of interlocker and that role with the US, given its relationship with the US. And that's the one point. The second point is what India had then launched after its presidency or during its presidency of the G20, and that is the India, Middle East, Europe Gateway Project corridor, economic corridor. And I think that in itself also begins to tell you what's really happening within the configuration of these groupings, both in the terms of the role that the BRICS subgrouping or the BRICS grouping in the G20 is playing, in terms of the role that this is now playing out with regard to the geopolitical issues around whether it's the infrastructure corridors, whether it's the investment corridors, the economic corridors. But you're beginning to see these kinds of interesting, I wouldn't call them tensions, but this interesting kind of juxtapositions that are developing in terms of where the BRICS would be in the context of, has China got its way in the BRICS? Is the big question at the last summit. Did the question of expansion, did the expansion come in a smooth and free-flowing way? No, it did not, because really it was at the 11th hour in terms of what was going on behind the scenes that actually it was kind of like, I think the way it was put to us is that there were two countries one country that was not willing to actually sign off on the names of the countries in terms of announcing the expansion of members until something else had to be given in return. So I think what's going on in the BRICS right now is the contestation around how you may be pushing back on not just the question of Russia, but the question of China. And is it now being elevated in the way in which these coalitions are essentially coalescing around, for example, what I think is an important thing that we need to go back in terms of how South Africa joining the BRICS may have been an issue in terms of devaluing or muting IPSA in a way, where now India has finally got the upper hand strategically and from a geopolitical and geostrategic context in its relationship between the global north and the global south. And let's be honest, Prime Minister Modi says, India is now the voice of the global south. It's about elevating the voice of the global south through its hosting of the G20 and what it did in January of this year, where it said it's hosting a forum for the global south, but not inviting G20 members. It's about what the global south, who are not G20 members, want to hear, and then of course bringing the African Union as the 20th or the 21st member as a bloc in the in the G20. So I think invariably these kinds of issues that we talk about in terms of coalition building, really the question would be now is how much of the expansion of the BRICS would start to see regional economic consolidation and manifestation starting to happen. Because if it's now about these 6 countries and really the byline at the summit, especially in the media center where I had the privilege to attend the summit, was that this is BRICS's Middle East policy with Egypt, with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran. And it also was the question of what China was trying to negotiate between Saudi Arabia and Iran over the tensions. And of course, it's still up in the air because Saudi has to come to the party on Yemen. So there's these geopolitical issues of conflict as well within the Horn of Africa, within these areas. So when it comes to the economic issues, I think what's important is what does an expansion of BRICS mean for the economic? So if we take the expansion as a secondary point, and I'll come back to this later, the economic question right now is you're not necessarily saying that we're going to move away completely and create a single currency. I think that has been a myth that has been constantly had to basically be addressed, even as late as when the summit leaders came out and said, well, not the summit leaders, but when the Sherpas came out and said, we're not creating a BRICS currency. But media still said there's going to be a BRICS currency announced at the 15th summit. And the Sherpas had to go back to the media and say, no currency. The local payment system, I think, is critical in terms of how it's going to not necessarily take the dollar out of play in the international financial market and in terms of the structural power that the dollar has in production, finance, credit, knowledge, and security, and how you actually define commodities and commodity markets, and how do you transact. But it's actually going to try and find ways to reduce vulnerability, to mitigate risk. And I think that's something that's going to be important. To completely take countries in Africa, for example, off the dollar is going to be very, very difficult because you're going to create a central bank currency crisis in Africa. You're going to create an inflation crisis because this is how countries use the dollar as a transactional value. It's an asset, it's a property asset, there's no competition right now. So you can't really go and say that the renminbi is going to compete. Yes, they have special drawing rights in the IMF. Yes, they're able to be a global reserve currency of some sort. But to do this in a way that the media had portrayed it as the BRICS are coming in with a third global currency reserve was just completely mischievous, in my opinion, because what it did was it created a perception that was not real. The point about the economic issues is that what China has done with Argentina, for example, I think is critical to understand in terms of expansion. Argentina's interests and China's interest is that, from what I could gather and I understand, and I stand corrected on this, is that Argentina holds more holds more renminbi than it holds dollars. So what it means is that you are able to now use the renminbi because the Chinese currency is part of the special drawing rights in the IMF. You can negotiate for one tranche of the IMF loan to be paid back in the renminbi. Now, whether or not the candidate who's very popular in Argentina now and in terms of the presidential elections wins, you're going to probably have to raise the question of whether or not Argentina will take up membership of the BRICS in 2024 if he wins and he says, I don't want to become a member of the BRICS. But the argument is that if you want to dollarize the Argentinian economy, you may be actually deepening the economic crisis. So there's these very political questions around the expansion. On the issue of whether or not the BRICS' economic gains are going to outperform itself, it's still very early days. But what the bank is doing is that the bank now has decided that it will lend in the currency of the BRICS countries. So it can lend in the renminbi, it can lend in the rupee. In fact, it has issued I think $1 billion rupee fund, a bond market. It's done the same thing in South Africa. It's issued a South African currency bond in terms of the BRICS. So what they're doing is that it's the instruments around the financial architecture that are being kind of not redesigned, but reconfigured in a way to enable not necessarily replacing the dollar, because these countries know replacing the dollar, you may not have absorptive capacity to do so. But what you can do is reduce and mitigate risk. I want to come back to Argentina as a last point, Ken. And the Argentinians do have a very critical resource that the Chinese want, and that's lithium. They have about 3 big major lithium farms that they are basically mining lithium in Argentina. And once that starts to happen, we're now getting into the very politically charged territory of critical minerals, because critical minerals is not just about your electric vehicles anymore. It is now being repurposed in a way that can be used for military applications. And I think this is where we're beginning to see these questions around the chip industry, etc. And then lastly, last point is what India has done in terms of positioning itself in the global value chain around the critical minerals as a manufacturer, as a supplier. So these contestations that we're talking about, whilst they're happening within the BRICS, it's also opening up the global south in a way that I think has never been brought to the center stage in many a year, even when we had people like Raul Plebish talking about the UN Office on South-South Cooperation and the dependency questions and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that expansive view on sort of the economic implications of BRICS expansion, etc. So, Mihaela, if we can dig deeper on sort of this question of the deep networks that exist among BRICS countries and the things that we often don't see in the communiques or in the news reporting on BRICS. How do you think the expansion will impact sort of the ongoing institutionalization or capacity for effective cooperation within BRICS? So, I think so far we've highlighted sort of like the more positive impacts of BRICS among member states, or, the hoped for, or some may say aspirational sort of agenda of BRICS. But it's also true, as Sanusha was pointing out, that, there is competition within BRICS. India, China, India can offer itself as sort of the friend-shoring option for global North countries that are trying to decouple from China. And so, how should we think about intra-BRIC relations? How have they managed their relationships with the inherent conflicts within them in the past? And how should we think about the management of those relationships moving forward, given the expansion, right? Because incoming are, Egypt, Ethiopia tensions, Iran, Saudi Arabia tensions, India, China tensions, etc. How should we think about BRICS management of its affairs before and after the expansion, after the last summit?
So I think what's important is to look at how BRICS operates in practice. What are the internal processes? And there is this like informal procedure that countries are not supposed to cross each other red lines, which means that if there is a controversial issue your country doesn't want to get addressed, you don't address it. Only the issues move forward that you want to put forward and other countries accept. So there is this like almost like experimental method. You throw out issues that you care about, and then you see which ones catch, and then you build on them over the set of summits. So the way currently process works is that when you have a country holding presidency, that country has the agenda setting power, and that country is organizing all different meetings throughout the year. So what's important is that the BRICS has proved to be very resilient. And I was like, we have actually an issue on in Global Policy Journal on why BRICS survived despite India-China conflict. And we asked like people from each BRICS country, my co-editor and I, from each BRICS country to explain how this played out and why BRICS could actually survive. And we saw that these internal procedures are very strong. And the other thing we saw that actually BRICS had, in a way, peacemaking effect that that brought India and China to the next BRICS summit. So in a way, BRICS did help with conflict resolution. What helped is that they completely compartmentalized conflict. So the conflict was not discussed during BRICS. So in a way, like the fact you need to think about BRICS in that sense, like UN, you know, you are not going to the UN General Assembly and then having a fight between two countries that are generally in conflict. So that's more about, you know, compartmentalizing the immediate conflict. And I'm actually, I think that the conflicts between Ethiopia and Egypt, or between Iran and Saudi Arabia, are better off if they are in BRICS than if they are outside BRICS, because BRICS will open up new areas of cooperation and there will be more issues to trade on. So negotiation-wise, better negotiation packages will be available. So, so in that sense, I don't see BRICS participation as negative for these countries, nor do I see that the fact that they are all in will be drowning BRICS. What is a problem for BRICS is that it's much harder, like in practice, it's harder to negotiate among 11 people than among 5 people. So when you look at all these different networks they have, yes, deals will be possible, but the transaction cost of negotiation, unless you put stricter kind of procedures and have better facilitators and kind of are much more formalized, it's more difficult. I also wanted to pick up on this question of the depth of network. I think when people talk about BRICS, you can look at BRICS network, but actually the way BRICS operates is that that's just like one aspect of it. There are a lot of bilateral deals that are the building blocks of BRICS, or trilateral deals. So in a way, you can look at BRICS also as a marketplace where you come and then you see, you identify the interests, and then you follow up with those who express the same interest, and then you can, so that's why when you have a big BRICS summit, there are always these bilateral, trilateral deals that come up on the side. So I think a place to watch is IPSA. Like IPSA was like taken over almost, like there are 2 areas of cooperation that stayed independent, but most of the areas functionally were in a way translated into a bigger group. And I mean, IPSA still exists, it's still there. But when you think about the evolution of IPSA versus the evolution of BRICS, it's day and night. And in a way, I think I saw Foreign Minister Jaishankar in a way trying to revive IPSA, especially around the Security Council reform discussions, because both, like IPSA has been pushing for Security Council reforms for a long time, and that's one area where BRICS has not delivered for IPSA. So unless there are major changes on the Security Council front through BRICS, I believe that IPSA will again get more attention and will need to coordinate more to be a bigger pressure group within BRICS to get that support and actually lead to the reform of the council. I think I wanted also to point out some other things to following up Sanusha's great remarks. I see right now all of the countries saying like, I'm a leader of Global South, like India, then it was like Brazil the other day. So you can find the officials saying like how they're positioning themselves as leaders. And I am now thinking, you know, do we really want the BRICS to be the leaders of the Global South? I mean, when you look at trade in particular, their interests are not as aligned with other states from Global South. So, I mean, shall we think about now in all of this realignment? I mean, maybe Malaysia and Indonesia should be leaders of the Global South. So in a way, we should not take the oxygen out of the conversation of who will be the leader of Global South. In my mind, the place is open, and it's not necessarily one of the BRICS countries, no matter how much they try to position themselves as leaders. And another thing, we have some of the countries now saying, oh, we are bridges between. So I would always be questioning, are you really a leader? Are you really a bridge? Or shall we now move on to other countries who may be representing Global South interests in a different way, more creative way, or like in a way that's not BRICS agenda way now at this point, right? So just a thought.
Yeah, yeah, but you know, it's an interesting thought in the sense that, right, I think Asia, I think the absence of Indonesia as one of the new members was kind of an interesting question mark. In Africa, Nigeria is missing in action, which again, you know, is a big question mark. And I think within the different regions, it's interesting how the bigger countries that haven't joined BRICS yet, right, also positioning themselves as potential alternatives. And it will be interesting to see if BRICS and its agenda moves more in the direction of geopolitics, what these other countries will do, right? I think Nigeria and Indonesia in particular, sort of two big countries that haven't signed on, will be interesting. A quick follow-up on the question of institutionalization, right? So, I mean, if we can get, you know, nerdy a little bit on IR theory, is it useful or helpful for BRICS to stay more or less informal, or do you think with the growing size, it might help them to look and feel like a normal international organization with a secretariat and all that? What are the, from your perspective, what are the advantages and disadvantages of either approach? Yeah, Mihaela.
So first of all, I don't think that the model, the EU model, is the model for BRICS. They are different in the sense that they don't want supranational institutions, and it's not the track they're taking. The way EU developed is through trade. I mean, BRICS did not develop through trade. So there is that difference. I think we need to think about maybe the group more like ASEAN, or more like if there was some kind of model, or more like a European trade area, like, you know, where you have, let's say, for example, like I could totally imagine now, if we are talking currencies, I could totally imagine BRICS being like a payment network, like having the summit, like the group, and then having like the BRICS payment network with like the new development bank at the center, and having basically trying around this structure. So keeping informal group, having a bank for those who are more economically inclined to cooperate and are ready to contribute, and then having this like broader payment network for those who want to trade in local currencies. So I would see BRICS as developing its own hybrid model. And I don't think any of the old models should be rehashed, because they are their own entity and they need to develop, adapt in the way they see fit. That being said, just the pure amount of transactions that will be needed to get these countries together, and there is a need for technical support, but whether that technical support should actually be like an international organization with a door that you enter, yes, of course, they already have New Development Bank. So I would more see that like some hybrid model with the group, and then the bank being the only one with the door.
Thank you for that. Sanusha, I guess, you know, one question that has been at the back of my mind is, obviously member states have their own sort of domestic economic agendas and goals, which they're pursuing individually, but also collectively. But it's hard to separate that from the bigger geopolitical questions of, reforming the UN system, the global trading system, global financial architecture, etc. So, what happens to BRICS if, say, IBSA members, India, Brazil, South Africa, don't get the UN Security Council seat? Or we don't see any movement in reforming the World Bank to make it more accommodating of, China's size and the Global South membership in the voting arrangement here in DC. What happens to BRICS? Do we see it getting stronger? Will there be a fracture within its members if, say, China and Russia are not willing to dilute their power within the UN Security Council by admitting new members, or China doesn't want India in? How should we see BRICS moving on, whether or not we solve these geopolitical problems that they're trying to push onto the agenda collectively?
I think, Ken, the challenge is really what I think the UN Secretary General said at the summit in his press briefing, where he made a very powerful statement and took a lot of body blows for it and had a lot of pushback by mainstream media when he said, if the global system is not reforming now, it is bound to fragment even further, and we can't have a world of what it was like of after 1945. And in the room, he took a lot of criticism. He took a lot of criticism in mainstream op-eds and in mainstream media. But I think the problem with this is that as long as the UN Security Council is in this kind of status quo around the veto power, and to be quite honest with you, I think India and Brazil were very clear when expansion started to become a key issue in terms of developing a modality. And we talk about an institutionalization and whether you're going to have a door to the institution of what is the BRICS. And quite rightly so, as Michaela has said, you've got the bank, but you also have regional offices of the bank, one in Africa, and of course, one now opened in Brazil for the Latin American, South American region. So there's this regionalization of the BRICS as well from the kind of institutional architecture, and it's there, and you can't ignore it in terms of whether or not the bank's lending is going to start now moving away from the kind of global financial equity markets where it's becoming much more difficult to raise capital, given the fact that countries are caught in the kind of currency fluctuation of borrowing in dollars, and the question of how the debt question is being raised as a countervailing force to that, particularly by as China re-indebting countries in Africa and elsewhere. Will the BRICS change if you don't see a kind of genuine reform of the UN? There was a debate circulating before the summit as well, and the question was, is the UN still relevant apart from the UN Security Council? And if the UN Security Council is stuck in this kind of contradiction of terms, where China, the US, Russia, UK, and France are the 5 key countries that have the veto power. And if they are talking about reform, what are they reforming? Is it just to admit new members in and be like, tap yourself on the back and said we reformed, so it's reform light? Or are we going to transform and say we're going to take the veto away? And perhaps an indication of this is the fact of the matter that President Xi Jinping did not attend the UN General Assembly, nor did his foreign minister. They gave a lot of ventilation to the G77 plus China that was hosted in Havana. And are these becoming the key dramatic areas of what's going on in the global architecture and the governance question? As long as you have these kinds of competing interests, then you may end up in a situation where, for example, India may start using, and I completely agree with Michaela on the fact that India is revitalizing IBSA right now in a very real way, in terms of, the impression one gets is that India starts a kind of momentum in BRICS and says, let's push back on this. And then, of course, you get the sense that Brazil then ends it off and saying, this is what we're going to do. So they kind of play this tag game in the BRICS, and they kind of tag each other in and move it. And this is what they did on I think on expansion, where expansion became a critical issue in terms of whether or not you were going to announce the 6 countries. And of course, Indonesia was actually the consensus candidate. And of course, Indonesia said, no, they can't join. They just don't think it's the right time to join for whatever reason that was. But I think this is where we are right now, is will the fact that you don't get reform in the current architecture of the global governance frameworks and institutions, will that derail the BRICS? I'm of the view that I don't think it will derail the BRICS. I think the BRICS will redefine itself, reconfigure itself in different ways. It will have other institutions where it can take the questions on the Security Council to other spaces. I mean, the point about the Saudi-Iran issue and why China is so critical to have that kind of mediation between these 2 countries and get them to cooperate. It comes back to the fact that there's a vacuum left in the Middle East through US policy, through Middle East policy. And so this vacuum has now created the opportunity for China to move in. Whether you agree with it, whether you disagree with it, whether China has developed a concrete Middle East policy, whether it has managed to maintain stability, whether it has navigated the kind of institutional geopolitical issues in the Middle East, it's still there. And I think this is why you got to raise the question of whether or not an expansion of the BRICS actually becomes a critical issue for the muting of the UN Security Council. Because now you may not have to go to the UN Security Council for certain of these issues. You can bypass the UN Security Council because you already know the moment you put it onto your agenda, one of the P5 are going to veto it. And some proposal they're going to veto. So would we now see this question of peace and security and the resolution of conflict starting to take on a regional complexion where it starts to move in these regional spaces where countries that have joined, like the UAE, like Egypt, like Ethiopia. I mean, Ethiopia and Egypt over the dam issue, the Grand Renaissance Dam and the conflict there. But we already saw the Egyptian president starting to speak to the Sudanese president around certain levels of cooperation and mitigation of conflict. This brings us back to the question of what is the role of regional institutions beyond the economic. So I think, yes, a hybrid model is very important, but the payment system and the political context of the payment system and the economic interests as well is going to intersect along whether or not the BRICS are going to basically reconstitute itself, or it's going to basically have a problem with not reforming and not taking the reform of the UN Security Council where it needs to go. I think right now it's very much symbolic for India, Brazil, South Africa, because they've stuck to that narrative. They've stuck to that context of saying we have to reform. But the question is, you want to reform, but if you don't get the veto, are you still willing to reform?
Yeah.
Just
So Mihaela, and as you make your sort of follow up on Sanusha's point, one other thing that I'd like you to address is we know what the US's position, or at least it's been obvious in the press and elsewhere, the US's position on BRICS, right? Especially with the sort of very prominent roles for Russia and China in the unit, right? I'd like you to also speak a little bit about the EU, right? So ahead of the BRICS summit, we saw France trying to sort of invite itself. The BRICS members said no. How should we think about the EU as a bloc responding to BRICS? Will member states sort of try and do what France has often done, which is try to differentiate its approach from that of the US and the broader Western alliance? Will the EU hold? How should we think about the EU response to BRICS? Assuming that, we know exactly what the US response has been so far. Over to you.
Thank you. So just to follow up on Sanusha, when she was talking about, I love the comment about like how now we are looking at regional security and more regionalization. So I'm thinking like the UN Charter came the full circle, because the idea was always in the Charter that you first try to resolve problems at the regional level and then you move them up if you can't, right? So in a way, this kind of subsidiarity principle is now full at work if we are looking at it that way, which kind of raises the question if we expected from the UN Security Council too much in the first place. And that was like an extra expectation that the UN Security Council could not meet. So are we just kind of sizing it up the right way? But anyway, just to move to the question of position on BRICS, I don't see with Biden administration a BRICS policy paper or a BRICS strategy paper. So there is no formal policy on BRICS. There was a question that was posed to the Biden administration officials whether it's a geopolitical threat. No, it's not a threat. So, and then it was like whether the US will incentivize countries like not to join, and then the answer was like, you know, countries can make their own decisions and they can join whatever they want, whoever they want to join, which I think it's a fair response. You know, I mean, you can't be micromanaging other countries' foreign and development policies. So in that sense, I think the communication from the Biden administration side was very diplomatic and very open. In terms of policy, it has always been the bilateral, like fostering bilateral relations with IPSA countries, and then managing tensions with China and Russia currently, right? And then, but when we look at the EU, there is like you see kind of that there is a lot of commonalities of policy, especially in the context of Ukraine and in the context of kind of joint positions at G7 or even at G20. But you see some differentiation in terms of approach to China. You see some differentiation in terms of BRICS, and like you rightly mentioned, the President Macron, but I think here you also see the economic dimension. So we are talking here about political interest, and we're talking about economic interest, and economic interest in terms of currencies, in terms of diversification of currency. So I think there is some sort of kind of gap that's bigger than on the political side of things. So in that sense, but at the same time, there was some discussion in academic papers, at least on the EU BRICS policy, but it didn't go far. It was like, it also is not like you don't have like, at least I haven't seen, might be, but I wasn't specifically looking at EU response, but I have not seen that EU has like a well-developed response, like saying, okay, this is what BRICS is, this is what EU wants, and this is how we are going to approach it strategically. So it may emerge, we never know, but like for now, I can't say I've seen anything along these lines. So it's more like you have like one country from the EU like heading out saying about its own policy, but not the EU level, what would be the policy of the Union.
Excellent. Thank you both. I will now open it up to Q&A. And the first question is from Professor Anita Palmer at Howard University. Thank you, Anita. So Anita asks, so to Sanusha, Anita has been following your work and on BRICS, and she's asking, you know, will you please share more about the civil society track in the BRICS, who participates, and what issues the CSOs involved amplifying, and is there space for CSOs to shape the trajectory of the BRICS? And I think more broadly, right, is this just to thinking about BRICS? Is it just a sort of a president's club? Or is it more expansive than that? Is this also like a people's club, so to speak?
Thank you, Anita, and it's lovely to meet you online. The BRICS civil society, I think you have to look at it by case, by country rather. If you're looking at it from the context of South Africa, I think you have a much more emphatic engagement between the Sherpa. The Sherpa is the the ambassador who does a whole lot of the heavy lifting and puts everything into place, very much like those that go up the Himalayas and helps everyone to climb up there. So Ambassador Suklal, who's our Sherpa for the BRICS, has a very good relationship with the civil society stream, and they actually have their own kind of civil society meeting called the BRICS Civil, where they also put together a declaration which then gets sent to the main summit itself, and it gets integrated in terms of the key areas they want to see. One of the key things that the South African BRICS Civil Society or BRICS Civil Stream has been doing with partners in India and Brazil is to look at the impact of the loans of the bank. And what the bank is funding and what kind of impact that's having in terms of infrastructure development and so forth. In the case of China and Russia, it's the civil society there is a little bit more differently constructed and defined in terms of how they want to engage. It becomes very much part of the state-led approach, in my opinion. And I think it does then raise questions about whether there's a broader sense of space for the civil society groups to engage. Now, I think we have to distinguish as well that civil society is a very broad term. It can mean anything and everything and include a lot of different stakeholders and actors. So the civil society stream that we're mentioning here, Anita, is really the ones that are working in the NGO sector, working in spaces like looking at advocacy work, looking at the role in terms of making, for example, the conditions and the contracts on the banks, MOUs and financing arrangements open and transparent. And in the case of South Africa, because we have legislation to that effect, which is called the Public Information Act, you can actually apply to those through those acts and legislation to actually make this information available. Having said that, I think my colleagues who are working on the BRICS civil society stream find it difficult as well, because in these agreements that are signed between the bank and the countries where loans are being given for infrastructure development or for project financing, they have certain conditions that are put in there that are called non-disclosure agreements. And so non-disclosure agreements are inherently put into these agreements, and so you can't make them public, and so it becomes a difficult space. But I think from what I could gather, and I haven't been really engaging in the civil society stream, mine is more on the academic think tank spectrum, and that is that you have that engagement from the South African side, you have the information that's also coming in from the Brazilian side, and there's an engagement as well from the Indian side. I'm not sure where it is in terms of Russia and China. I think through Russia, it come through the Duma, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, this becomes an interesting space as well, because within the civil society, there's also different conceptualizations of what the role of civil society is. What is their duty? What is their articulation? Do you actually only align to the state, or you don't align to the state? So I think South Africa has a very rich history, as you know, of advocacy, of civil society, pushing the boundaries, pushing the limits, taking government to court like we normally do, and just trying to get transparency up and running in terms of what these non-disclosure agreements mean. Because, for example, if we are signing a contract with, or we're getting a loan from the bank, what does that loan entail, and who is actually responsible for paying back the loan? The last time I checked from the bank side, from the New Development Bank, that if they were giving a loan to a state entity, like in our case, Ewan will know that we have a electricity utility called Eskom, and it's in very, very dire constraints right now because of it can't keep the lights on all the time. That loan that I looked at and I saw was actually a loan that came in, but the guarantor of the loan was the state. So if Eskom defaulted on the loan payback, the state then is held liable to pay back the loan. So it was a state sovereign-backed loan. And that, again, raises questions around how these loans are articulated, how they are formulated, what negotiation strategies go in, and civil society here has been playing a role. But they've also been playing a role in terms of other aspects around governance as well when it comes to human rights and so forth. So it's a good space in South Africa. I'm not sure how much it articulates and ventilates and percolates even further in other countries.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Next question to you, Mihaela. Tamanska Lilo, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is asking, is the impact of BRICS, will it merely be measured by the number of states lining up to join? Or, should we think about its economic opportunities among member states? So there's a question of geopolitics, perhaps leverage vis-a-vis existing global institutions of global governance versus the economic impact in member states. And then will its geopolitical impact be realized within our lifetime? Question about, what do you think is sort of, how should we calibrate our expectations, I guess? And then, back to the question of, how should we think about those two questions, especially in light of the fact that the member states are not always on good terms on other dimensions, particularly here, China and India. And perhaps if you could also talk a bit about, the problem that Sanusi highlighted, which is this institutional incongruence, right? So Brazil, India, South Africa, very open societies where there's opportunity to keep governments in check. Not so much so in India and in China and Russia and some of the new member states. How should we think about the people-people cooperation and how to impact the official relationships across the member states?
Thank you. I'm just sorry about background noise. My neighbor is doing reconstruction, but I hope you can hear me. So I think that when we are talking about adding countries, politically, what this means is that if you are in multilateral negotiations where you have a group of 190 plus countries, if you are one country, your voice, it's almost, you can be the most powerful country in the world, but your voice is not enough to sway the rest if you want to have a particular agenda pushed. So the reason when we look at why are there are more countries and more powerful countries, that means that they can potentially form a critical mass in negotiations to create impact, and the impact through coalition building. And I'll give you an example. So let's say now, if in terms of negotiating new regulation, if there is some new regulation, let's say on AI, BRICS, expanded BRICS can start developing this collaboration, can start developing the governance model, and they're much stronger if they come with the first draft of the governance model together, and then other countries need to respond to it. Then if every individual BRICS country brings its own model. The other thing I wanted to say is there is this impact in when will the impact be? Will it be through our lifetime or not? I'm not sure how old you are, so I don't know how much time span I have. But okay, I'm thinking by the time my lifetime ends, I'm thinking AI will take over. I'm joking, but we have right now an enormous impact of technology and AI revolution. So that is one area. At the same time, we have climate degradation. So there is one area. So when we are looking at very long term, humans are squeezed between climate and AI, between a digital, virtual, artificial world, and between the environment and human environment systems and how it changes. So I think these are the two big ones that will, where BRICS is an actor that might be on the side of history that helps address these problems, or it may complicate the resolution if it cannot find consensus at the right time. But I think when you ask about more imminent questions, I think the most imminent question is, if you are looking at New Development Bank, if you're looking at all these currency initiatives, I want to see how are people there is all this discussion, what will it do to US, what will it do to others? The question for me is, how does Human Development Index change, and whether that can be tracked? For me, the question is a person who doesn't have access, who doesn't have digital inclusion, doesn't have financial inclusion, is that person better off if there is like some new grand deal in BRICS on improving digital and financial inclusion? So how do the vulnerable and disadvantaged members of society fare? And I think that should be the attention, and that should be like the test bed, whether groups like this succeed or fail, because otherwise you have just kind of the regular discourse, like there is a globalization momentum, there is the anti-globalization, and those who suffer keep suffering. So I don't like that in a way like approach. So I'm like, when I look at BRICS, I look at, okay, can you produce innovation, and can you show me that this innovation actually makes a difference in the lives of those who are disadvantaged, vulnerable, and who wouldn't have access to opportunities or access to resources, without it. So, and I say that's the same test for the US, that's the same test for other countries, and that should be our test.
Yeah. And a quick follow-up on that, right? So Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor here in DC, had his big speech sort of outlining the Biden administration's economic agenda and sort of basically sounding the death knell for the Washington Consensus. Do you see, is there a possibility for BRICS to be an anchor for continued sort of open global trade, or should we see BRICS aligned to sort of the economic sort of outlook that the U.S. administration outlined in Sullivan's speech?
Me?
Yes, that's a follow-up for you.
So, I mean, I think BRICS should do their own thing. I mean, there is space for consensus, but there is space for thinking how BRICS wants to position itself. So, in the sense of that's a longer negotiation question. But I think the trade question is actually the more problematic one, because we see that the BRICS trade cooperation has not really reached major levels, and no matter how hard, like the asymmetries were there, that's where you see the power differentials between China and others. So I think that trade is a good test about whether cooperation can work and what is the level of commitment. And right now, and that's something that's very measurable. So right now, there is the opportunity and momentum to develop trade. So if now we don't see improvement on trade, then we can just say like trade agenda is definitely not the one that BRICS, that will be like a place where BRICS shine. So another question here that we'll see, I think, more of is this competition between trade and environment agenda. There have been a lot of discussions about how to bridge these agendas. And I think that's like one area where WTO and where you see the especially international financial institutions were working hard on, but that's very much an open-ended process. So I think that's one area where we will be kind of on the watch to see how trends play out. But that's an important trend, because that will in a way define like sustainable development, if it happens in practice, if it's measurable, and how inclusive it is.
Thank you very much. The next question, I think Joel Odota's question, which was on how the expansion will impact intra-BRICS coordination and cooperation, has been answered. He asked it earlier on. So I'll move on to Bob Wekesa. Dr. Wekesa is also visiting at Howard and a good friend of the African Studies program here at Georgetown. Bob is asking about this question of member states leveraging BRICS for their own internal agendas. And Sanusha, perhaps because you're in SA, could you tell us, how, from the South African perspective, how is South Africa leveraging its own position and membership in BRICS to pursue its agenda? And here, if we can sort of historicize the process a bit, right? Post-apartheid South Africa initially, especially under Mbeki, wanted to be the gateway to Africa. and I think that ambition has somewhat dimmed, or maybe it hasn't. You can tell us. And then BRICS came along, and on the continent, perhaps those of us north of the Limpopo often wonder why South Africa is missing in action on the continent, because it could be a gateway into the region. So how should we think about South Africa's leveraging of BRICS in Africa, and also facing outward?
Thanks, Ken. And it's good to see Bob online. I think when it comes to South Africa, it's always been the outlier in terms of the BRICS. What was its value proposition? What was its strategic orientation? What is it going to be offering the BRICS in terms of the size of its economy, the size of its population? Is it going to be one that's going to strategically kind of push the African voice, the African agenda? And I think for many analysts, both within South Africa and outside of South Africa, it's always leaned towards this idea of being the curious actor in the BRICS, not really finding what its position, identity, and value is in terms of its membership in the BRICS. Not because it doesn't kind of synchronize with the economic kind of credentials of the other members, but really in terms of, does it really have an Africa policy? And I'm going to be very open and honest here, and I think my government's going to catch me somewhere along the line when they listen to this recording, is that we kind of work on the assumption that because we have been given this kind of role of the African agency, the African voice, it's an automatic that we represent that voice, we represent that agency, we represent that interest. And one of the things that struck me after the 15th summit, and when I looked at the expansion, and now also in terms of the G20, is really the challenge that South Africa needs to now think of a strategy for Africa. What is its Africa strategy? Because it's no longer the voice in the G20. It's got the AU, and it's a big bloc. And that's going to change as the membership and the rotation of the chair of the membership changes of the AU. So that's going to be something you've got to be much more, you've got to have much more advocacy in Addis Ababa right now in terms of how are you going to position, what is it that you want are those spaces that you feel are critical for Africa's integration into the global economy, whether it's under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, whether it's around global value chains, whether it's around peace and security, whether it's about the role of Africa in global multilateral, and including global multilateral of the South. So I think that's going to be one that South Africa has to now really start to dig deep and dig much more in terms of strategic orientation as opposed to transactional foreign policy that says that we are here because we've been recognized. Well, you've been recognized, but somehow you've kind of lost the recognition somewhere between your membership joining the BRICS and then, of course, 10 years later, where you now are, you have to deal with the possibility that maybe when India is hosting, or maybe when Russia is hosting, they're going to come up with other members that they're going to put on the table. And so this thing about, and it goes to a little bit of what Joel was asking and others were asking, is when do you stop expansion of the BRICS? Do you ever stop expansion of the BRICS? Does it become an unmanageable club that you can't necessarily have that engagement? I think expansion of the bank has been interesting because expansion of the bank still enables the 5 core members to retain a 55% controlling interest of the bank. Now, the UAE has joined the bank. Uruguay is in the process of joining the bank. And I think the other country is Egypt, if I'm not mistaken, or Bangladesh. Now, the UAE has a lot of petrodollars, a lot of money, let's put it that way. And if they're going to contribute to the bank's shareholders as a shareholder, if they're going to contribute to the bank's finances, do they still want to be a minority shareholder with the 5 countries being majority shareholders? And this is going to be critical in how you're actually going to see this expansion of the BRICS as a grouping of countries, and the expansion of the bank, where there are some real issues around how do you raise capital in very, very volatile equity markets. And countries that have joined now have that money. So that's going to be a question. South Africa, I think, has to now think about what it has been innovative. Let me be honest. It has been innovative. It has put on the table the BRICS Business Council. It's put on the table part of the incubation of the BRICS Bank. It was part of its identical contribution. It's kind of created BRICS Civil. It's created the women in business. It's created the BRICS kind of linking to the think tank and the academic forum, and a number of other issues in terms of the youth forum and the SME sector, which is going to be critical. But what I think is a bit limiting, or where it falls short, is it creates the idea, and the innovation of the idea then doesn't go through. Somebody like China comes along and says, BRICS partnership, outreach partnership that South Africa innovated on has now become BRICS expansion, which China has innovated on. So I think these are some of the challenges that our government, whoever's going to come into power next year after the election, will have to think about, and who's going to be the foreign minister as well, will have to think about. But I think it also talks to a little bit of whether or not South Africa now has to think about, does it just look at the BRICS, or does it now start to strategically also orientate in IPSA? Because before the 15th summit, there were a few academics from the Indian subcontinent that were saying that maybe this is not the right time for expansion of the BRICS. Maybe you should think about elevating IPSA. And I think it's happening in the way that IPSA is not going to be just a piloting of development projects, a small $1 million fund of 3 countries, but it's going to be much more than that in terms of strategic elevation and how it plays its role. So I think the tensions in the BRICS right now is really the question of whether or not what Bob is asking is it really about Brazil and India and South Africa, or is it really about how BRICS is now basically between Russia and China and India, Brazil, South Africa on the other hand? Because remember, the security architecture debate in the BRICS was really around the Russia, India, China informal club. And that is now no longer there, although China is still a member of the SCO. So if you start to break down the BRICS, you've got a number of sub-regional groupings that are coalescing together, and there are these tensions around Pakistan, around Kashmir, around the Bay of Bengal, and also the Indian Ocean Rim.
Thank you. And I think that's a great segue to the last question to Mihaela, which is, as the war in Ukraine rages on, and as the Western alliances response sort of sharpens the differences between the West and everyone else who's not in the Western alliance, what will that mean for security cooperation within BRICS and its wider geopolitical role? Because China, all the non-Russia BRICS members have been doing a pretty good dance so far around the question of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But as the war rages on, will we see it becoming more salient or more attenuated as a focal issue with regard to BRICS? And what would that mean for any potential security cooperation within BRICS?
Thank you. So, I mean, that's a really interesting question. One thing that we've seen is that security cooperation has been on the table from the from the get-go when BRICS started, and there was always this idea of Security Council being as part of the declarations. What we see is in 2016 was increase of the security agenda, but through the counterterrorism lens, and that was very much India, Brazil driven. So I see that there has been a continuation of security agenda, but at the same time, if you want to discuss security, not discussing, you can, I mean, there was discussion of food security, right, at the summit. But if you want to discuss security, then if you need to stay away from Ukraine and stay away from Security Council, you better not touch security, because you have members who really want to discuss different exactly specific security issues. So I think personally that it's a much safer bet to discuss finance, because now all the attention is on finance and trade. And when we looked at in terms of issues, there are 22 finance issues that BRICS opened for discussion. And you see only a few of them survive through. So there are a lot of issues that there was initial interest. So I think the finance agenda is really broad and can be really picked up by these countries. That's less controversial. One area, actually two areas where I see security agenda come up, if we want to leave like Ukraine and Security Council reforms aside, is in the context of nuclear. So now the last summit declaration has this like technology neutrality language and so on. So in terms of nuclear negotiations and in terms of like Iran and questions of nuclear enrichment and so on. So I think that's one area where it will get attention. Another area is security in terms of outer space. And that's an area that also connects to sustainability. So I think that's one area where regulation is both non-transparent, very much needs to be developed, and that would be like a big project, and a lot of the countries are interested in outer space. So I think that's another area that I'm looking at. But to be said is that from the very start, BRICS decided not to be an alliance, that it didn't want to formally be against somebody, and they didn't want to have formal treaty. And I think that was a decision that everybody was on board with, and we can see defense cooperation, like in terms of like, exchanges, exercises, and so on, but more at the sub-BRICS level than at actually the full BRICS level. So that would be, and just to say one thought about Tusanusha, you know that South Africa was the one, I think, who proposed the vaccine center, or like BRICS, and that was something that, again, like several years later, it was China that kind of started the BRICS Research Vaccine Center, and I'm like, there should be some like IP property on ideas, like we have in the EU,
Yeah.
Ken, can I make two very important points that we should touch on?
We're taking out of time, so very, very briefly, and then I'll hand it over to you to close up.
Just to mention on the security issue, I think one of the things that is going to be critical is the digital security architecture around public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, questions around issues with regard to critical minerals as well. But I think the big challenge that we have in the declaration, where it's muted, but it doesn't touch on it, is the question of creating big data centers. Those are technologically security issues. And India and China, and I go back to what Bob was asking around tensions, we look a lot about India and China in terms of the border wars, in terms of the whole question of the territorial issues and the disputes. And we never even mentioned the Indo-Pacific issues as well, in terms of territorial sovereignty, security of South China Seas and all of that. But one of the things that India brought up in the G20, which I think circles back to the BRICS, is the question of digital public infrastructure architecture. And this is now something India wants to put out in OpenServe, but also this is coming back to the US and the question of digital security architecture, because if you think about it, it goes back to lending in your multilateral development banks as well. Who's funding what and what kind of digital centers you're getting? Thank you.
Well, we could go on forever, but unfortunately, we have to stop here. I have learned so much. It's been wonderful having this conversation. I think we should make it an annual thing to, get together and talk. And thank you, Yoon, thank you, Brennan, and everyone in the background who made this possible. I enjoyed this very much, and I'll hand it over to Yoon to send us off.
Thank you again to our speakers, Michaela, Sanusha. When a conversation is this animated and this engaging, and we have all of these questions from the audience, I feel like, oh, I did a good job putting this together. But Clearly, this is a very topical and timely discussion, and your expertise is well noted. So thank you so much for agreeing to participate. Thank you, Ken, for the beautiful job you did in moderating, and thank you to. We lost about half the audience along the way, but for those of you who have stuck it out this whole time, thank you so much again for joining us. The Africa-China Initiative has 3 more events coming up in October. And if you registered for this event, you'll be added to our mailing list. And so you should get information about those as well. We look forward to more conversations of this sort, as well as really interesting book events about new books focusing on Africa, China that have recently come out. So we hope that we'll see you all again. Thank you again to our speakers, to our moderator, to Brennan Young, our new program assistant, and to Marta Manzano, and to our colleagues at the U.S.-China Dialogue and African Study Center at Howard. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we'll be in touch soon.